Hi, this is Michelle from Layers of Learning. I'm back. My kids are in the other room starting their maps for China and watching a video while they do it. So I'm free. I'm going to talk to you about each of the subjects that Layers of Learning covers, kind of our basic philosophy behind each one. So I'm going to begin with history because that's the first topic, the first subject that's covered in each of the guidebooks, in each of the unit books. We do history in chronological order, more or less. Civilizations overlap, so it's not always perfectly chronological, but we begin with the Fertile Crescent in ancient Sumer. We don't cover cavemen or evolutionary history. We don't cover Christian Bible history. We just stick with the academic subject of history, which begins with historical records for the most part. Some archaeological records too, but we want you to cover those things if you desire. We leave space in the curriculum for you to do that. You can head into any issues you want to that aren't necessarily in the curriculum, but we don't cover them. We don't cover them. We will let you do that kind of thing on your own. This is what if you were going to pick a spine to our curriculum, it would be the Usborne Encyclopedia of World History. This is our favorite. There are some others that we recommend too, and they're good as well. And we actually have correlation charts for several encyclopedias like this that go with Layers of Learning. You don't need to read this. You don't need to buy it. But it's handy to have a book like this on hand because often your library won't have books that you want, or you don't have a chance to get to the library. It's just not convenient. And so we'll open up this book and we can read a 2-page spread on, here's one on the spread of Christianity. We have a unit in Layers of Learning on Christianity because it's hugely impactful to the history of the world. And so you would read this 2-page spread about Christianity when you were doing that unit, and that would kind of give you a basis. Again, you don't have to use a book like this. It's just nice to have on hand. Christianity, from a historical perspective, is really difficult to find books on, especially that are written for children. So we actually covered a lot of topics that are similar to that in that they're difficult to find. And the History Encyclopedia does cover those when other sources don't. So also, Karen wrote this, came up with the idea for this book of years, and I made the actual book. And it is to replace the timeline, or to do in addition to the timeline, although I would choose one or the other. We used to do timelines, and we have timeline squares in nearly every unit. So that the idea is that you want your children to be able to see how each of these civilizations connects to the other. So you talk about ancient Egypt, and then later on you talk about ancient Israel. Do they ever overlap? If you teach them separately, then in your child's mind they don't. They each happen at their own time in history. They're completely separated, but in reality they weren't. So what the timeline does, or the Book of Years does, is it connects all those different civilizations to each other. You see that at the same time Columbus was exploring, that's when the other events were happening in Europe. So we've begun this one with my children. Here's one on Babylon. And here's how it works. Karen did a better video that goes into this in more detail. But basically, when we did Ancient Babylon in the Layers of Learning units, we read some books on Babylon, and the kids took things from those books that they found interesting, and they drew pictures, and then I wrote on it. Depending on how much your kids like to write, how old they are, they can do the writing, or you can. My kids really hate to write. But I use this as a way, it helps them to write even though they're not doing the physical writing, because they're composing. They are summarizing, and so it does help them in their writing process. And it helps them to remember what they've done. And then at the top of the page is the actual timeline. So we sell this. Here's one that has a timeline square. This is about Stonehenge, so this would be the ancient Europeans. in very ancient history, there's not a whole lot going on. We don't have a lot of historical dates. Here's a couple of dates that actually go with Babylon. And we just cut these out of the printable and pasted them in the correct places on the timeline. So the children are learning how to use a timeline by finding the right spots to put them. And then they can see when civilizations, things are happening at the same time. So here's one for Egypt. Here's one for the Hittites. If we go further in the book, we'll see where some are, we've got more than one civilization on the same page. And as we go further and further into our history, we'll have more and more of those overlapping. So here's one that shows Carthage was founded. This is the Phoenicians. And close to the same time, we have the Iron Age of Europe beginning. So it's interesting to point out that these things are happening at the same time. That's the purpose of the timeline. And that's why we use the Book of Years. Then in geography, I found this particular atlas. I've purchased a whole bunch of them so that I could see which are best from a homeschooling perspective of learning about countries around the world. I really like this one. And the reason I like this atlas is because it talks about the countries and it has a map, but it also goes into details of the civilization and the culture. And that's really what we want. We want to cover maps, but also cultures, belief systems, the physical geography, what's it like there? Not just a map. We don't want to just be able to find where Colombia is in the world. We want to be able to know, okay, well, there's rainforest there. This is the kind of farming they do. These are the problems they have. This is some of their arts and crafts that they do there. These are the kinds of foods. I want my children to know all of that. And that's what Layers of Learning does. And this particular book, Geography of the World, from DK, really does a great job covering individual countries and cultures in that way. And then science. This is my poor science encyclopedia. I've owned it a long time. It is completely falling apart. I kind of need to buy a new one. But the DK Science Encyclopedia, and they've come out with new editions since this one was published, but they're similar. They're very much the same. So it goes into quite a bit of detail on each of the topics, but in a non-textbooky way. That's what I like about all of these encyclopedias. They're not textbooks. They don't have review questions, and they're not so boring. And I'll read this with my children, but we don't necessarily read every little bit of it. We just talk about it, and we'll look at the pictures, and we'll read the captions, and we'll see what interests them. And we go through covering things that we can't find library books on. Science has a lot of those gaps for kids too. There are certain topics that are covered copiously, like ecology topics. You can find lots of stuff on that, but finding things about chemistry that's written for kids, not so easy. So having a book like this is really handy. And then this is one that Karen found. This is her favorite for the arts. It matches up best with Layers of Learning, and it covers art in closest to the way that Layers of Learning philosophy of art. So this is mostly visual arts, but they do cover stage and screen. They cover music, which is part of our philosophy. This is photography. They talk about different movements of art, and they discuss some of the artists and some of the most famous paintings. So this is our favorite to pair up with Layers of Learning if you want to buy a guidebook that sort of goes with it best. Again, all of these books are optional, and your main resources should be your library. But not everybody has a great library. Not every topic is covered by authors, and you don't always have the leisure to go to the library. So I really like having books like this on hand. It's really helpful for when you get to the library list and you just can't find something. I hope that